One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness to bind them.
With the recent centennial of Armistice Day coming and going a few months ago, I would be remiss if I did not mention World War I and its dramatic impact on Tolkien's life and the conception of good and evil found in his writing. Both the professor and Hitler fought in one of the largest and bloodiest clashes in human history, the Somme offensive. So one might be tempted to ask, well, did they come face to face and have a death match like Fingolfin and Morgoth? The Battle of the Somme was large in scale both geographically and in troop numbers. 3 million Germans, French, and British participated, so the chances that they met are pretty minuscule. And they obviously would have had no cause to recognize one another, since they were still in their relative youths, well before they trod down quite distinct paths to worldwide fame. The battle was filled with every horror of brutal trench warfare we are told World War I had to offer. Revolutionary new ways to kill men in greater numbers than ever before made their warfare debut along the blood-soaked banks of the French River, including, but not limited to, the tank, the machine gun, and mustard gas. In just 4 months, over 1 million men were dead or wounded. Despite the constant threat of death and the unending carnage, Hitler relished his dangerous role as a messenger, or runner, for the German forces, until he was wounded in the leg by a shell exploding near his runner dugout. He begged not to be evacuated and proved a restless patient while healing, chomping at the bit to get back into the action. Say what you will of the future Third Reich leader, but his courage was unimpeachable. It's doubtful Tolkien exhibited similar enthusiasm, as the first day of the skirmish proved the deadliest ever for the British Army, with 60,000 casualties and over 60% of British officers dead by nightfall. Amazingly, Tolkien, soon to be one of those officers, managed to survive and went on to take part in a decisive victory, seizing Regina Trench from the Germans, though he eventually succumbed to trench fever and trench foot, and, like Hitler, was removed from the battlefield. Unlike Hitler, however, he would not return to fight in the war. As many of you may already know, Tolkien lost some of his closest friends in World War I, 2 of them dying during the Battle of the Somme. To say the war had an effect on him is like saying Frodo and Sam ran into a few minor difficulties on their way to Mount Doom. Virtually every disturbing battle scene in The Lord of the Rings, and there are quite a few, from the ambush of the Southron men in Ithilien, mentioned in the last episode, to the sacking of Rohan's villages by Saruman, to the bundles of severed heads catapulted over the walls of Minas Tirith, and so on, can be chalked up to the horrors Tolkien witnessed firsthand in World War I, especially near the banks of the Somme.
It was no brigand or orc chieftain that ordered the assault upon the Lord of Mordor's greatest foe. A power and mind of malice guided it. As soon as the great catapults were set, with many yells and the creaking of rope and winch, they began to throw missiles marvellously high, so that they passed right above the battlement and fell thudding within the first circle of the city, and many of them, by some secret art, burst into flame as they came toppling down. Soon there was great peril of fire behind the wall, and all who could be spared were busy quelling the flames that sprang up in many places. Then among the greater casts there fell another hail, less ruinous but more horrible. All about the streets and lanes behind the gate it tumbled down, small round shot that did not burn. But when men ran to learn what it might be, they cried aloud or wept. for the enemy was flinging into the city all the heads of those who had fallen fighting at Osgiliath, or on the Rammas, or in the field. They were grim to look on, for though some were crushed and shapeless, and some had been cruelly hewn, yet many had features that could be told, and it seemed that they had died in pain, and all were branded with a foul token of the lidless eye.
Now, I doubt the Germans engaged in psychological warfare that gruesome, but I have to say that scene was the first time that I remember as a boy being legitimately disturbed and horrified by something I had read. I recall trying to, if you'll excuse the wording here, wrap my head around why anyone would do such an awful thing. It was one of my earliest encounters with the concept of terrorism, or attacking your enemy's morale rather than the enemies themselves. And it would not be until I went on to read The Elfstones of Shannara by Terry Brooks and I met the Reaper that I would experience similar feelings of genuine, visceral horror from something I found in the pages of a book. But perhaps the most vivid moment in The Lord of the Rings, which clearly can be attributed to his wartime memories, is when Frodo, Sam, and Gollum cross the Dead Marshes. Not only is the dreary, sodden terrain reminiscent of actual fens scattered throughout the Somme Valley in France, but the ethereal visions of corpses floating in stagnant pools are direct portrayals of dead soldiers lying in flooded trenches. When Tolkien's critics complain that his notion of good and evil is too simplistic and black and white, I believe they are, at least in part, keying into the dramatic, wrenching nature of such scenes, while failing to realize that Tolkien only meant them to relate to the psychological effects war can have on the innocent, not necessarily epitomize factions within his tales. We don't have to think this is what the Dark Lord hath wrought in such moments, but rather imagine how overwhelmed our previously naive and innocent Hobbit heroes are feeling, just as Tolkien felt during the Battle of the Somme. As we will see in this episode, Tolkien has a far more nuanced view of good and evil than most realize, though one could argue he could be excused for such given the stark black and white nature of his wartime experiences. Whether deservedly so or not, a lot of praise is heaped on literature and other art forms of the morally ambiguous variety. I guess they are seen as appealing to adult sensibilities, whereas clear notions of good and evil, dark and light, right and wrong, are reserved for instructing children with less developed moral compasses. I myself have to admit I enjoy a good dose of moral ambiguity every now and then. In art I choose to consume, the Man with No Name trilogy is a cinematic favorite, and H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu myths are a literary favorite of mine. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the phrase moral ambiguity or stories that exhibit it, just means that the ethics of the main characters or plot lines do not conform to accepted wisdom of what amounts to good and evil behavior or themes. For example, in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the final film of the Man with No Name trilogy, the three main characters are thieves, cold-blooded murderers, and grave robbers, and yet we are supposed to relate to and root for them throughout the film as they hunt down buried treasure, each one plotting the entire time to keep it all for himself, of course. Unlikely protagonists with dubious goals, to say the least. And in Lovecraft's Cthulhu myths, the universe is crawling with all-powerful entities vying for control of something. Perhaps dominion over lesser, frailer beings like humans who struggle to understand their motivations and survive the deadly chaos that arises from them. Now, I should clarify here that I am talking only about the stories written by Lovecraft himself, not those of authors such as August Derleth, who took up the baton after his death and chose to wrap the cosmic horror of his universe in more simplistic perceptions of good and evil, something more like what Tolkien's critics accuse him of. When I read Lovecraft, I am reminded of halting efforts by real humans to comprehend the uncaring natural world around us and the larger cosmos as a whole that we inhabit. Is the awakening of Cthulhu and the rising of his sunken city R'lyeh more puzzling and disturbing than an erupting and expanding volcano growing out of nowhere in the middle of the ocean, or a massive undersea quake causing a deadly tsunami? Are the Outer Ones, Elder Gods, and Great Old Ones terribly different from all the strange, violent phenomena occurring in the cold depths of space, like the black holes devouring suns, colliding neutron stars, gamma ray bursts, and so on? all of which are incomprehensibly powerful and destructive to the astrophysicists who study them their entire lives, let alone average people like you and me who lack the training to come to grips with the enormity of their devastating potential. The real universe is arguably more chaotic and evil than one filled with unending supernatural gothic horrors. But Arda, Eru Iluvatar's creation, is it not starkly different from both the real world and a morally ambiguous universe like Lovecraft's? Well, let's first take a look at the creator himself. As far as all-powerful beings go, you could do much worse than Eru. Greek and Roman and Nordic gods, among countless others, seem bound and determined in their mythological tales to make life miserable for their puny worshippers, harshly punishing them for the slightest transgression or human flaw. And on the monotheistic end of the religious spectrum, things don't get much better. Yahweh is forever eliminating as many humans as he can to cleanse the earth of their hopelessness, despite being the one who made them that way. This is the moral ambiguity of most gods and religions in the real world. Animistic, pagan, or monotheistic. It really doesn't matter. Whereas Eru, despite being partial to an occasional genocidal flood, much like Yahweh, and being fairly unforgiving about who gets to be immortal and who doesn't, is pretty much as benevolent a deity as one can hope for. And the Valar, to the extent that they can be considered pagan gods rather than angels under a monotheistic Eru, and I should take a moment here to point out that my assertion that Tolkien's universe is strongly monotheistic has been challenged in the comments section of the Hierarchies versus Equality episode. So be sure to check the comments after watching the videos to see who is keeping me on the straight and narrow, and don't hesitate yourself to correct me if you notice one or several of my mistakes. It helps keep my channel from becoming a monotheistic universe. Anyway, to the extent that the Valar can be considered pagan gods, they are distinguished from those in other fables by their, well, pathological altruism. I hate to bring up Sam Harris for reasons regular viewers of my content will understand quite well, but the Valar would be the ultimate divine curators of his moral landscape, because they are forever seeking to minimize suffering and maximize prosperity, and perhaps even bliss for the children of Iluvatar. They are in fact benign to a fault, and cannot conceive of what the only evil one among them is capable of, and as a consequence they continue to make devastating blunders and errors of judgment. And Morgoth, being a sort of single point source of the evil, is another way in which most critics see Tolkien's universe as highly two-dimensional or black and white, with little or no gray areas. So that's it, right? Arda is clearly bereft of moral ambiguity because, as Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, put it in the opening quote, moral issues are reduced to, quote, cosmic battles between absolutes, unquote. It all comes down to the Valar versus Morgoth. And if it weren't for one evil being, one malicious entity determined to ruin everyone's good time, and I do intend good here in both the enjoyable as well as the moral sense, Arda would be a pastoral wonderland free from pain and suffering. So either you're on Team Good or Team Evil in Tolkien's universe. End of video. Thanks for tuning in. See you in the next upload. But seriously, consider what it is that ultimately allows Morgoth to spread his deceit and corruption. It is, strangely enough, the very angelic nature of the Valar. On the surface, good does seem to possess the power to overcome and even eliminate evil altogether, at least in the early days of Arda. After all, the Valar managed to capture and imprison Morgoth, and the world has peace for a time. So progressive detractors appear to have a point about absolutes, as the opening quote from the former Archbishop suggests. But the Achilles heel of the benevolent powers of Arda is that they are so virtuous they decide, rather than eradicate it, they will instead give evil a chance to redeem itself. It is the innocence and naivete of the Valar that allows for evil, once contained, to propagate yet again throughout Valinor and Middle-earth. Good is therefore complicit in, not completely innocent of, or distanced from, evil's spread, as Tolkien's critics would have us believe. Does the pathological altruism of the Valar remind you of something in the real world? For reasons of self-preservation, the purest of intentions seems to require tempering with a healthy dose of moral ambiguity. This is the professor warning his readers that, as cliched as it sounds, the road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions, and ignorance is no excuse. As mentioned in the Hierarchy versus Equality episode, the Smiths of Eregion had nothing but good intentions when they made the Elven Rings of Power, and despite that, ended up facilitating Sauron's aims to rule over everyone. And yet, just like nothing is wholly good, the plans of those who seem utterly evil can be turned on their heads as well. Take the One Ring, for example. If Galadriel, or Gandalf, or Denethor, or whoever among the wise were to use it, they would accomplish great acts of benevolence at first, but depending upon the strength of their will, over time, of course, the ring's evil would almost certainly begin to consume them and turn them into a new Dark Lord. However, the creation of the One Ring, though seemingly a master stroke of dominance and seizure of power, is not unlike a strong move in chess. Although it may allow you to remove many of your opponent's pieces, now you are committed to this maneuver and this tactic, and any and all of its weaknesses, and the ways it exposes you to your opponent's attacks. Whoever wields the One Ring to attain mastery and dominion over others, be it Sauron or any of the wise, it does not matter, is reliant on the very existence of the ring, and his or her power can vanish in an instant should a way be found to take it away and cast it into the cracks of doom. So the question is, did Sauron do himself any favors by creating the One Ring? Or did he simply provide his enemies a convenient means with which to vanquish him? Would Sauron have been better off ignoring the elves of Eregion altogether, and establishing the foundations of Barad-dûr and his empire in Mordor without the One Ring? He was, after all, a very powerful Maia, perhaps the most powerful being in all of Middle-earth during the Second and Third Ages, with or without the ring. So would he not have been better off resisting the urge to land what he thought was a quick and decisive victory by usurping all the rings of power? Would a slow and steady assault on his enemies have proved the wiser approach? Nothing about good and evil in Tolkien's universe is, as his critics claim, cut and dried, not even the One Ring. Now, one could argue that I am conflating design flaws in the schemes of good and evil agents, or their tactical failures, with the inherent nature of good and evil. To which I would only respond, these strategic errors do seem to recur quite often in Tolkien's tales, though, do they not? They do seem to be the rule rather than the exception. Even Morgoth, when he adulterates Feanor and the other Noldor's impressions of the Valar's goodwill, merely seals his own fate, ultimately anyway. And the Valar's solution of a final cleansing war against Morgoth, and the drowning of the lands of Beleriand, and lifting the island empire of Numenor from the seas to give the Edain a new home, only allows for Sauron to establish his own domain and entire ages of fresh corruption. So you need to ask yourself why this theme keeps cropping up in the legends of Middle-earth. Tolkien is not merely lecturing you on sound strategy. He is teaching you a fundamental lesson about primary motives. The purer the aim, the more profound the failure. The quote from the Archbishop also suggests that progressive critics believe Tolkien's alleged misogyny and racism are interwoven with or part and parcel of his supposedly concrete notions of good and evil. After all, the progressive theory goes, if you are guilty of not appreciating the gray areas, the moral ambiguity, you will probably miss as well all the wonderful ways in which genders and races meld and blend, and we are all of us perfectly equal to one another. If you can't see the lines between good and evil are blurred, you likely will be incapable of recognizing all the remarkable similarities between a female African pygmy and a 6'5" Northern European male. Hopefully, I've thoroughly addressed the accusations of racism and misogyny in previous episodes, and I plan to demonstrate the nuance I believe can be found in Tolkien's conception of good and evil by the end of this video. But I want to take a moment here to highlight a way in which progressives, hypocritically enough, really like when he speaks in absolute terms, despite asserting that doing so is problematic and typical of a provincial bigot. And this takes us back to a question I posed in the introductory video. Is Tolkien a Nazi or a tree hugger, or somewhere in between? Now, I don't know if I've proven that Tolkien was or wasn't a Nazi, but hopefully I've proven that it's an asinine question to ask, or a meaningless accusation to cast. The tree hugger bit, though, it's clear the environment, or at least pristine wilderness, since the environment is such a politically loaded term these days, it's clear untouched wilderness was something Tolkien valued, something good in his estimation, and its destruction something evil. Only a couple years before he died, Tolkien drafted a classic and memorable response letter to a fan named Carol Batten Phelps, whose original communique expressed concern over the cult atmosphere emerging among his American following. The main point of Tolkien's reply was to address the freakish and cult-inspiring success of The Lord of the Rings, and how it had all but grown so large Tolkien no longer felt the story even belonged to him. A critical idea I hope to address and expand upon in the conclusion episode. But the letter touched on many topics, including his view of the treatment of the environment in America. And let me go ahead and read an excerpt. Not until I got your letter did I learn that M.R. Ridley had done me the honor of placing the works of his old colleague in the ranks of literature, and gaining me intelligent and well-equipped readers. Not a soil in which the fungus growth of cults is likely to arise. The horrors of the American scene I will pass over, though they have given me great distress and labor. They arise in an entirely different mental climate and soil, polluted and impoverished to a degree only paralleled by the lunatic destruction of the physical lands which Americans inhabit. A tough pill for us American fans to swallow, but not one without medicinal benefits if you can keep it down. Though I will point out that over the centuries, the Brits have managed to turn their island into a giant livestock moor, so people in glass houses and all that. Surely the percentage of total original forest impacted in each nation is comparable, though the rate unquestionably has been accelerated in the US, and the overall acreage unmatched. Anyway, Feanor is a clear example of Tolkien's affection for unspoiled wilds. It is an old-growth forest, undoubtedly, and one which the professor chose to give, well, fangs, so it could protect itself from the ravages of Saruman's, quote, mind of metal and wheels, unquote, an obvious reference to modern machinery in the real world. Now, it may already be clear that I share Tolkien's concern for the state of the wilderness in the modern world. It is in fact yet another way in which his works are endearing to me. Without sidetracking this video with yet another self-indulgent departure from the main purpose, let me just quickly state that reverence for nature is one of the few vestiges of my liberal past that I choose to hold on to. But I have to admit it is rather doctrinaire to assert that it should be left completely untouched. It is a rigid view of how the world should operate, yet progressives are perfectly happy to embrace this particular black and white aspect of Tolkien's moral perspective. But there's another lurking, less obvious problem here, one which I just rather slyly tried to slip past you unnoticed when I said my reverence for nature was a vestige of my liberal past. Why is concern for the environment automatically considered a liberal cause? This is a myth we've all come to believe, and one progressives are more than happy to encourage, though arguing the case here will waste a lot of time I don't have for this episode. Suffice it to say, Teddy Roosevelt, a conservative American president, created our national park system, and Tricky Dick Nixon, another conservative, founded the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And perhaps I should stop there because I know whining about the environment was wearisome to most people 30 years ago, and the numbers haven't decreased since. But it may prove instructive to contrast Tolkien's treatment of the natural world with that of J.R.R. Martin, who is often described as the American Tolkien, and he even has the middle initials to prove it. Besides, it doesn't require a lengthy analysis. If you wander into a dark and foreboding forest in Westeros, the wights, wargs, and direwolves are not going to spare your life because they like your cheerful hobbit voice. In fact, your sparkling personality will probably only increase your odds of meeting a vicious, horrible death. And this is perhaps a microcosm of the overall difference between Tolkien's world and Martin's. The former offers at least a few sanctuaries and bucolic elven havens, and provided you enter such oases with the right intentions and a minimum of past grievances, you need not be related to the locals. The latter, however, is filled to the brim with all the scheming, brutality, and misery our own medieval times had to offer. If any universe is black and white, with clear demarcations between good and evil, it is Martin's. You step outside familiar, friendly environs, you become prey. You have just passed from the light into darkness. It is that simple. On the surface, progress for the modern liberal is the great motivator and equalizer. Advancements in science, technology, economic development, and social theory and organization amount to a rising tide that lifts all boats and improves the human condition throughout the world. rendering differences between individuals meaningless or even non-existent. That's the theory anyway, but see, there's a fly in the ointment that you put in there intentionally with your pesky desire to maintain your country's borders. How can all people achieve perfect equality worldwide when you refuse to allow them unrestricted access to your society's achievements? Paradoxically, rather than celebrate your own progress, you should feel guilty about it and consider yourself a horrible tyrant like Genghis Khan, who once said, "It's not sufficient that I win, all others must lose." This is exactly the mindset you are being accused of, while you bask in the glory of your success from behind your exclusionary walls. Progress in the modern world without open borders is, sad to say, supremacy and imperialism, especially or perhaps exclusively if you're white, because somehow I doubt that if a real-world Wakanda ever materialized on the African continent and shut off the rest of the world from its advanced technology with an impenetrable border wall, that progressives would utter a peep in protest. No fear of that happening anytime soon or ever, however. So those on the far left are safe in nurturing the split personality disorder when it comes to progress. It's fantastic in theory, but an imperialistic plague in reality, because borders in the Western world, though under constant assault, remain stubbornly intact. And yet, it is Tolkien we are led to believe by his left-leaning critics who is the enemy of progress. While liberals decry the success of Western civilization to the point of demanding the removal of it as a subject from university curricula, the professor is supposedly the one who believed it was evil. And it is with this paradox in mind that we can analyze Tolkien's nuanced view of progress, and how he did in fact see it as a force for good at times. He wasn't anti-progress, he was conflicted, just like progressives, but without the duplicity and guilt for his own people's accomplishments. Right or wrong, Tolkien chose to embrace or discard progress based on a remarkably unwavering courage of his traditionalist convictions. Consider the labors of the Valar to prepare Arda for the children of Iluvatar. If Tolkien was purely anti-progress, why have Barda sprinkle the heavens with stars for the elves when they awaken on the shores of Cuiviénen? Why not lead them in the dark? Why build the lamps and grow the trees of Valinor to light the world? Why put the sun and moon in the sky when those things fail? Why build the hidden realm of Gondolin and the island empire of Numenor? Why construct the thick walls of Minas Tirith and the mighty pinnacle of Orthanc? Now, you may say all of that progress is allowed because it doesn't violate what we had in the Middle Ages. It does not violate the backward-looking ideals of Romanticism. Okay, but why make a thoroughly anachronistic technology like Palantirs? They are essentially a super powerful FaceTime app because they don't even need a willing recipient on the other end of the call. Given an impressive mental will, you can direct their gaze, let's say, anywhere you want. They're essentially untethered surveillance cameras. Forget pan, tilt, and zoom. We've got an invisible drone camera with an inexhaustible battery, which can travel great distances instantaneously. Who wouldn't want one of those? Why make the elven rings and give one to Gandalf to increase his power? Why create fireworks to entertain and enrich the lives of frivolous hobbits? And on and on and on. This is why I believe the Romanticism label applies to Tolkien rather loosely. Progress is a mixed blessing for Tolkien and riddled with moral ambiguity. Its pros and cons, or its good and evil facets, are not always clearly defined. Palantirs cause or contribute to the downfalls of both Saruman and Denethor, but one also allows Aragorn to draw Sauron's attention away from his preparations for war in Mordor, causing him to strike before those preparations are complete. Who knows how Frodo and Sam would have fared in Mordor had a Palantir not been available to Aragorn. Though he certainly did not take Genghis Khan's approach toward it, Tolkien was also fully aware of progress's potential to be a threat to rival regimes. Now let's consider the hidden realm of Gondolin once again. It is inarguably an improvement on the quality of life for elves in Beleriand, because it removed them from the malice and violence of Morgoth. And for that very reason, for the reason of Morgoth not being able to corrupt and degrade Turgon's realm, like he was able to do with every other first-age Noldor kingdom, it is an ever-growing threat to the Dark Lord. An untouched Gondolin is a Gondolin able to amass arms and troops and defenses, and hope. It is a Gondolin progressing, unlike Fingin or Maedhros or Finrod's realms, which forever seemed on the decline due to Morgoth constantly assailing and weakening them. In some ways, it is a greater threat than Doriath, because although Doriath has the girdle of Melian to protect it, that fence also confines it and restricts its expansion. Gondolin's girdle, let's say, is its secrecy, and Morgoth has no idea where it is, what are its bounds, and what innovations and preparations for expansion are taking place within it. He can at least capture elves from Doriath and force them to divulge what Thingol and Melian have in mind. No such captives are forthcoming from Gondolin, until he captures Hurin, that is. The story of the children of Hurin illuminates another disingenuous aspect of the Progressives' dual loyalties when it comes to progress. What Morgoth does to Hurin is typical of what he does to many of his enemies. He estranges or isolates them from friends, family, and allies, and twists and corrupts all they hold dear. And he often does so with equal measures of deadly force and manipulative speech. Remember, for Tolkien, language is critical to a people's development and their way of life. It is in fact a development in and of itself, a technology of a kind, or a sign of progress, to put it in more apropos terms. So there should be little surprise when Morgoth sows suspicion and distrust among the Noldor, using words alone and the twisting of their meaning. Look at how easily he manages to alienate Feanor and his sons without wielding a single weapon, other than his tongue. The grace, nobility, and generosity of the Valar come to signify something entirely different for Feanor. These virtues now appear deceitful in his mind, and an evil attempt to pacify him in order to control him and rob him of his great works. By the time of their exile from Valinor, their language has been poisoned against the Noldor. And I remind you of the real-world progressive attempt that I mentioned in the last episode, to render words like race meaningless, while retaining the damaging, ostracizing impact of related words like racist and racism. There is a very good reason why the English language is under constant assault from the usual progressive suspects. It is essential to English people and their way of life. This is why self-loathing language comes so easily to Westerners of European descent these days, and why they falter or sound hesitant and foolish when trying to express love for and admiration of their own people and their accomplishments. It's like using a muscle you've never been taught to move, or have been prevented from exercising or training. Tolkien knew very well how this could happen. The manipulative tongue of Morgoth is not just some convenient plot device. Once again, there are no coincidences. It is a strong warning from Tolkien to all of us English speakers. Do not lose your language or control of it. Do not allow your enemies to take it from you or turn it against you. Or like Feanor, you will soon find yourself disconnected from your own people and guilty of horrible things such as kinslayings and abandoning them at the time of their greatest need. And then it is only a matter of time before the final blow against you in your solitary and vulnerable state can be struck. From Maedhros to Beren to Finrod to Hurin and so many more, the recurring tactic is isolation from and then destruction of their familial and social support systems. What happens to Hurin is almost a caricature of this treatment of the Dark Lord's enemies.
Therefore, Hurin was brought before Morgoth, for Morgoth knew that he had the friendship of the king of Gondolin. But Hurin defied him and mocked him. Then Morgoth cursed Hurin and Morwen and their offspring, and set a doom upon them of darkness and sorrow. And taking Hurin from prison, he set him in a chair of stone upon the high place of Thangorodrim. There he was bound by the power of Morgoth. And Morgoth, standing beside him, cursed him again, and he said, "Sit now there, and look out upon the lands where evil and despair shall come upon those whom thou lovest. Thou hast dared to mock me, and to question the power of Melkor, master of the fates of Arda. Therefore, with my eyes thou shalt see, and with my ears thou shalt hear, and never shalt thou move from this place until all is fulfilled unto its bitter end." Unhappy was the lot of Hurin. For all that Morgoth knew of the working of his malice, Hurin knew also. But lies were mingled with the truth, and aught that was good was hidden or distorted.
And so, from afar, Hurin witnesses his family become so utterly eroded and atomized that his children do not recognize one another when they are reunited by what seems like chance, until finally these siblings fall prey to Morgoth's designs, as carried out by Glaurung, who unsurprisingly does more damage with his words than his scorching breath. Now, none of these people I'm about to mention are falling on their swords because they were tricked into incest, as far as I know anyway, but is the unpersoning of centrists and members of the dissident right, like Sargon and Millennial Woes and Alex Jones, terribly different in intent, if not actual execution, from Morgoth's methods? And by unpersoning, I of course mean removal from, or denial of access to, the means by which people connect these days on social media and crowdfunding sites that have become the modern public square. Is such isolation and relegation to impotent silence and observation from a distance of further division and conquering of their allies terribly different from what Hurin experienced? And who owns all these sites where social connection and public debate occur these days? What are their predominant political leanings? Why do you think these people are using the rubric of hate speech to take your language away from you, turning words that have been perfectly acceptable for centuries into crimes punishable by excommunication? Come to that is Glaurung's corruption of a strong and proud Edain family and its moral values terribly different from the war progressives are waging on the traditional family unit in our own world. Morgoth did not hesitate to destroy all that elves and men saw as wholesome and good in the First Age by any and all means, foremost of which was verbal deception. Similarly, when progressives gain control of new media sites or any other modern lever of power, they eagerly engage in wielding their newfound strength to disparage and silence opposition. As the opening quote from Peter Franklin points out, the left, when in power, has always taken up the ring and tried it on for size. And I would add to that, very much liked the luster and look of it on their hands. The notion of progress as a tide lifting all boats is quickly discarded by a progressive the very second he or she is in a position where doing so is self-serving. But again, we are told it is Tolkien who views progress as wicked and who is its enemy. Whereas I would say all Tolkien wants us to do after showing us dubious technology like the Rings of Power is ask ourselves whether or not progress is always better. Is it always good? The modern progressive, on the other hand, does not want that question, among many others, debated or discussed in the public square. What qualifies as beneficial progress will be decided for you, and if your people happen to be the originators of that progress, pride in such achievement cannot be taken from behind the safety of your borders, unless you are among the few races deemed incapable of engaging in supremacy for whatever reason. Even though, as previously established, race is a biologically meaningless concept and a problematic word, which, like many others in the English language, must be stricken from the dictionary and everyday speech. Okay, so that about wraps it up for this episode. Before ending this video, however, I do want to point out something I've noticed about the view counts this Tolkien series has been getting. Some people seem to be skipping certain installments, and while I don't want to be a nag, and honestly I appreciate whatever interest my videos garner, and consider it somewhat miraculous that anyone at all takes interest in my content, these episodes are intended to be sequential and build upon points made earlier in the series, so skipping parts may make them harder to follow, and it may especially become difficult to understand the points I make in the upcoming conclusion episode. Alright, lecture over. Hopefully I'll see you again for closing thoughts, and don't forget an ad endum analyzing the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings from a MGTOW perspective will follow that episode. And thanks once again everyone for tuning in.